Hi everyone. Welcome to Java Lesson 04. This is Tashwan Chu, your host here, and I am with my friend Ugen Chinle. And today we are going to learn uh, constructor in Java. Constructors in Java. Now, before getting started with constructor, let's just recap on what we have learned in the previous lessons. Lesson 01, 02, and 03. Now, Java is a class-based object-oriented programming language, and inside the class, there are 5 elements that I have already highlighted in the uh, previous lessons. That Java contains 5 elements inside the class, and those elements are variables, methods, constructors, instance block, and static block. Now, in the previous lessons, we have gone through variables and methods. Now, let's just recap on what is variable and methods. Today's lesson is on constructor. So before getting started with the constructor, let's just do some recap on what we have learned in the previous lessons. Now, uh, Java contains 5 elements. Now, first one is a variable. Now, what is variable? Now, variables are nothing but they are just a container that can hold the value. So using those variables, we are fulfilling the project requirements. Now, what are the types of variables? There are 3 types of variables. They are local variable, instance variable, and static variable. Now, what is local variable? Now, local variables are nothing, but they are variables which is declared inside the method or inside the block or which is declared as a parameter in the method and the constructor, uh, which has the scope only within the method. Now, what is instance variables? Instance variables are those variables which is declared inside the class but outside the method, which has the scope everywhere within the class. So that is the definition of the instance variable. And we have a static variable, which is similar to that of an instance variable, which is declared inside the class but outside the method with a static modifier. And we have also learned about 2 areas of Java, that is instance area and the static area. So I hope by now you have understood all those concepts. So if so, I want you to make sure that you know all the concept about this variable and the uh, 2 areas of Java, the instance area and the static area. If you know this concept, you will feel easier to program in Java. Okay. Now coming on. Methods, we have learned that methods are the group of statements which is used to write the logics of the application. Now the purpose of the method is to write the logics of the application. We have also learned the syntax of the method and all. Now today's lesson is constructor, the third element of the Java class. Okay. Now, what are constructors in Java? Now, constructors are nothing but they are the special method. So just remember, constructors are similar to their method, and it is a special method that is used to initialize the object or initialize the instance variables. Okay, and uh, and constructor is called when object of a class is created. Now, the execution of the constructors happens during the object creation. So how it happens and all we will be looking in the below slides. So this is the definition of the constructor in Java. It is a special method that is used to initialize the object or the instance variable, and constructor is called when an object is created. Okay. So this is the definition of the constructor. Now, now before moving in with the deep meaning of the constructor, let's look at the object creation. Now, in Java, I have in the previous lessons, I have highlighted on the creation of the object with the new keyword. Now, you might be thinking that object creation is only with the new keyword. So, if you're thinking that way, you are wrong. So, there are many methods that you can create the object. So, creating the object with a new keyword is one way of creating the object. So, there are other methods to create objects like and the one The first one is with using new keyword, then instance factory method, static factory method, then using the new instance, using clone method, then also we have using deserialization, then using the new instance method, then also pattern factory method. So there are a number of ways to create objects. Now for this constructor part, let's look at how we create an object using the new keyword to understand the constructor. Now, in the previous lessons, I've highlighted on this object creation with object creation in this format. Uh, so let's say if we have a class test in a Java file, then we can create an object like this. We can give test here, test, and now what this test, the first test represent is a data type, is non-primitive data type, is a class data type, okay? And we have now this test is the class name. So I'm just breaking down this object creation into parts to understand better. Now so before I've just highlighted on this is the object. Now we are looking at each part of the object. So the first one is test, which is a class name. Then we have t, which is a reference variable. It can be a variable. It is a variable name, and it can be also known as object name. So now equal to is the assignment operator. Now this assignment operator and all will be covering in the next lesson. So my friend will be talking on these operators and other like packages and all will be covered in the coming lessons. Now for now, this is the assignment operator and we have a new here. The new is the keyword which is used to create object. Now the main part is this test, open bracket and close bracket. So this part in Java is called constructor. So this is a constructor, test, open bracket and close bracket. This is the constructor in Java and this constructor will be executed during the object creation, okay, during the runtime. So till here, just remember that, just know that this part is the constructor and we have a statement terminator. So this is the object creation. So I have just presented this just to know where actually is the constructor in Java. So this test, open bracket and close bracket. So this is the constructor in Java. Okay. So now we have highlighted where is the constructor when we are creating the object. So I hope you have understood that where actually is the constructor during the object creation in Java. Now, coming next, we have now rules to declare constructor in Java. Now, how you're going to declare constructor in Java? So the rule number one is, so you have to remember all these rules while you are using the constructor in Java when you are developing the application and all. So you have to follow these rules. If you're not following these rules, then it will give error. So this is theoretical knowledge, but it's very important when you're developing the projects and all. Okay. Now the rule number one is constructor name and the class name must be same. So it's mandatory that class name and the constructor name should be same. So we have already seen that constructors are the special method. We can use the constructor similar to their method, but there is a difference, and that's why this is a special method. So constructor name and the class name must be same. Now the rule number two is constructors are able to take parameters similar to that of a method. Constructor will be also taking parameters, accepting parameters. And the rule number three is return types are not allowed for constructors. Now unlike in methods, we have seen that return types in method is mandatory, whereas return type for constructor is not allowed, is not optional, not option, not it means it is not allowed in Java. Return type in constructor is not allowed. So these are the three rules that you have to remember while using the constructor. Okay. Now coming next, types of constructor. Now, similar to that of a method, we have types of constructor. There are two types of constructor. The first one is default constructor, which is provided by the compiler. So now, by now, you have to know when compilation is taking place, when execution, when JVM, all those things. By now, you have to know what happens during compilation, what happens during execution, and all. Okay. Now, default constructors, that type of constructor, the number one is default constructor, which is provided by the compiler, and another one is user defined constructor. The user defined constructors are those constructors that the programmer declared in their program. Okay. Now, those are the two types of constructor. Now, coming next, I want to show some example programs based on default constructor execution and uh, user-defined constructor execution. So I want to start with the default constructor execution. So let's move with some practicals. So we have already created one Java file. This is test.java. So let's just remove this. And now let's do the example on default constructor. Let's just comment this. Default constructor. Okay. Now let's say let's declare one class. Class always class test. This is just a simple class, and let's just say we have public static void main. So we have declared the main method here. Now let's declare one method. This example is to understand the default constructor in Java. Okay, let's declare the m1 method. So it's just a simple method. So let's say let's just print something here. Let's say execution of method. Now this is the instance method, so we have to do it with object reference variable. Let's create one object here. Now let's call this method m1. So this is just a simple program. Let's try to execute this. I have command prompt open here. So let's just navigate to the directory where we have saved the test.java file. So I kept in Java cd and Java training cd. Just forgot cd. I kept in training practical. So here we have test.java. Okay. So let's try to compile this program. So we have wrote the program here. We have a test class. We have declared one method, and we are trying to call this method to the main method. Okay. So let's try to compile this and execute this. Let's try to compile first. This is how we compile. So compile successful. Let's try to execute. So we are we have we have output execution of the method. So why I'm executing this program is just to understand where actually is the constructor, just to show where we have executed the constructor. Now, earlier I have told you that this part, test open bracket and the close bracket, this part is called constructor. So now, where actually is the constructor? So when this constructor will execute it will execute this constructor will be executed object creation. Now as soon as JVM calls this main method, and when object when trying to create object, this constructor part will be executed. Okay, now where is the constructor? So we don't see any constructor here. Now what I'm going to let you know is that we are not declaring any constructor here. So now what the compiler will do is, if there is no constructor that is declared inside the class, then compiler will be generating a default constructor. It will be similar to this way. Let's say just comment it. And so here in the background compiler, if there is no constructor declared inside the class, then compiler will be declaring or generating a default constructor. So constructor name and class name should be same. So in the backend, the compiler will generating a default constructor. So this is the uh, zero argumented constructor. So there is no argument here, no parameter here. So that's why it is zero argumented constructor with the empty implementation. So now this is how default constructor is generated by the compiler during the compilation time. Now let's say, so this will happen in the background even if we are not declaring the constructor inside the class. If you are using, in the previous examples I have used the object. So how this constructor get executed is because of this default constructor that is being generated by the compiler during the compilation time. So this is how default constructor is generated in the background. Even if we declare this constructor here, so this will not give any error, because what will happen is, as soon as object is created here, then this constructor will call this constructor. So empty implementation. So this will be executed and output will be given. So execution of the method. So let's check it. Let's try to save it. After editing, you have to save the program. Clear. Java C s dot compile successfully. Now let's execute. So here we can see that no error has been given even if we declared constructor here. So this is how default constructor are being generated by the compiler. Okay. Now till here, just understand that default constructor is being generated inside the class even if we are not declaring the constructor. Okay. Now we have the user defined constructor. Now let's look at the example of user-defined constructor. This is how default constructor is being generated by the compiler. Okay. Now let's see user-defined constructor. How we use user-defined constructor. Okay. User-defined constructor. Now let's say let's just edit this code here itself. Let's just remove this. Not record here. Now let's say we have a method m1. Let's say this is method m1. And now let's try to declare one user-defined constructor. Yes, constructor name and class name must be same. This is mandatory. So this is a zero argumented. This is the zero argumented constructor. And let's try to print something here inside the constructor. Now, why I'm doing the logics here, so you will understand when we are looking at the purpose of the constructor. Okay, for now, just remember and just know that we are trying to print something here. Now let's see, this is zero argumented constructor. Now let's declare another constructor. Inside the class, you can declare multiple constructors. So let's say we have one parameter here. Let's say int a, and again let's try to print something inside this. So now this is the one argumented constructor. So let's say this is the one argumented constructor. Okay. Now let's try to call this method m1 in the main method. Okay. So this is the instance method. So we have to do it by object. Here we are creating one object. Let's say we are creating object t is equal to new s, and let's try to call this m1 method. T dot m1, and let's try to create another object is t2. Let's say t1. I have already defined one t here. New trace, and let's try to call this m1 method. Okay, t1 dot m1. Now while executing this while creating this object, let's try to call the zero argument constructor, and while creating this second object, that is t2, let's try to call the second constructor with the parameter int a. So similar to that of a method, when you are declaring a parameter, so you have to pass the value. It's very similar to that of the method. So in the previous lessons, we have seen that method in the method, when we are declaring the parameter, at the time of method calling, we have to pass the value. That is mandatory. Now in constructor also, at the time of constructor calling, we have to pass the value. So here we are trying to call the user-defined constructor with a parameter int a. So we have one parameter, so we have to pass integer value. So this is mandatory. So if there is multiple parameters here, like int b, float f, and all, you have to pass three parameters, if there are three parameters. So for this, we are just passing one parameter with one value in 10. Now here, what I'm going to tell you is this: what we are trying to do is that we are using the user-defined constructor. So we are not using the default constructor. So this is how. So if it is default, then it should be zero argumented and it should be empty implementation. But whereas in this user-defined constructor, we have declared zero argument constructor, but we have logics here. This is not empty implementation. We have the logics present in this constructor. Okay, here also this is the user defined constructor. So the programmer and the developer and all is declaring the constructor. So this is the user defined constructor. Now how the execution of this constructor will happen is, now for your information, I just wanted to tell you that this constructor part, so I will tell you this after the execution of this program. So let's just try to execute this program and just save. After editing, we have to save the code. Let's try to compile test.java. So we have compiled successfully. Now let's try to execute this program. Now here, what you have noticed. So let's just try to copy this. Let's see. Now here, what I'm going to say is that now I just wanted to uh, talk on the flow execution of this constructor of this program. So JVM will call the main method. Then as soon as the main method is called by the JVM, so object creation will be taking place. Now as soon as this object is being created, then now zero argumented constructor. This is the constructor part. So this constructor will be executed. That's why zero argumented constructor is being printed. So I have told you in the earlier that uh, constructor part will be executed during object creation. Constructor executed during the object creation. So why zero argument constructor? Why this part is executing first is because this part is executing before calling the method. So that's why we have to know that constructor will be always executed during the object creation. So here, as soon as the object is being created, we are calling this constructor, and this constructor is being executed, and zero argumented constructor is being printed. Now similar to that, after creating this object and executing this constructor, then the it will be jumped to next statement, that is t.m1. Now only the m1 method will be called, and this is the method 1 will be printed here. This is the method 1. Now similar to that, as soon as this object is being created, we have post one value here. So which constructor will be calling is this one parameter constructor will be called, and then one argument constructor will be being printed, one argument constructor will be being printed, and only then it will jump to the next statement t1.m1. Now this is just to let you know how the default constructor is getting executed, and how we are declaring the default constructor in Java. I hope you're understanding what I'm trying to say. So that's all with the user-defined constructor, how we use a user-defined constructor in Java. So that's all with the user-defined constructor. Now, uh, mm, uh, coming next, we have purpose of the constructor. Now, in lesson 03, when we are learning on the method, we have you knew that the purpose of the method is to write the logics of the application. Okay. Now, similar to that, till now we have been just using those constructor, and we never know what are the purpose of the constructor, why we are using constructor in Java. If there is no purpose in purpose of constructor, then it's no use of using this constructor. So therefore, let's look at the purpose of the constructor in Java, similar to that of the method. Now the purpose number one is uh, to write the business logics and business logics at object creation. So I'm going to show this purpose number one, to write the business logics at object creation with the help of example. Okay, so constructor similar to that of the method. So here we have the method and we have the constructor. So similar to that of the method, constructors are also used to write the business logics. So here I've highlighted purpose of the constructor. The number one is to write the business logics at object creation. Okay. Now how we are writing the business logic at object creation. So let's try to look with the example. Let's just try to remove this, and it will give error. Now, purpose of the constructor. Purpose of the constructor. Uh, Number one is to write the business logics. Now, this example is similar. This example will be okay to understand the purpose of the constructor. So this is how we are using constructor in writing the business logics. Okay. So here, I just wanted to write something here. So at this point, we are at this point, business logic will be present. Okay. Similar to this, here also business logics will be present. Now, when you will use this constructor to write the business logic is that at the time of developing an application. So when you are developing the application, you will get a requirement like you just wanted to execute something at the time of object creation. So here we have seen it. You will be required, and you will need a requirement that you have to write some logics to be executed during the object creation. That time you will have to use the constructor to execute your business logic at the time of object creation. So only then other statements will be executed. So if you require an requirement that you want to execute something during the object creation, you will be always doing with the help of constructor. Now this purpose is used only 25%. So other 75 percentage, it will be with a different purpose. So we are just going to show you. So this is how we are uh, using the constructor, the purpose of the constructor for writing the business logics. Okay. Now let's look at the next slide here. Now purpose of the constructor number 2. So here sorry now the purpose of the constructor number 2 is constructors are used to initialize some values to the instance variables during object creation. So this purpose is used 75% in the project development, in the real-time project development. So you have to understand this clearly. So constructor is used to initialize some values to the instance variable during the object creation. So now how we are using, how it is initializing those values to the instance variable during object creation, we want to do it with the practical and understand it, okay? So let's try to do it here. Purpose to initialize the to initialize the instance variables during the object the purpose number 2 is to initialize the instance variables during the object creation. This during object creation is important, okay? So you have to know. So initializing of the instance variables during the object creation. Now how we are initializing during the object creation? Let's just look at the example. Let's just try to remove this code. It's not required now. Let's say let's not use class test. Let's use class emp. So it shows some meaning for the example. So let's say we have a class emp, and let's try to declare some instance variables here. Instance variable. Let's say we have int eid, the employee id. Then let's say string e name, employee name. Then let's say we have float e salary, okay? Now let's try to declare one method. Now this example is to make you understand how to initialize the instance variable during the object creation, the purpose number 2. So this is very important in project level. You have to understand this purpose 2, to initialize the instance variables during the object creation, okay? So let's we are declaring 3 instance variables here. We are declaring int eid, then string employee name, then employee salary, okay? Now let's try to declare one method to display the employee id, employee name, and employee salary, okay? Let's say we have void disp. Let's declare one. This is the method to display. So let's say this is the logic of the application. Let's try to print the employee ID, employee name, and employee salary here. Let's say we have employee ID, EID. Then let's just copy this. So let's just change this name, salary, employee salary, then let's just try to print salary here. So this is the method declaration. We are just declaring one display method to just print out the values of this employee ID, employee name, and the employee salary. Okay. Now we have done the declaring the instance, three instance variable. Then we have declared one method here. So till here, I hope you've understood what I'm trying to do. Now let's try to call this method disp here. So this is the instance variable we are trying to access to the static area. So always we have to do it with the help of object. So this concept you will use in the project development, and you should know this concept. New test. Now let's try to call this method. So here we have created one object, and we are trying to call the display method. Now just predict what will be the output. So just predict in your mind that that will be the output. So I hope you have predicted what will be the output. So let's try to execute. Let's just save this. Now we have emp class. So we have saved the file as test.java. Let's just try to. We have to compile with the class name. Okay, class name. I mean file name. You have saved it as test.java. So we have some error here. Please remove or make sure it appears in the correct. Let me check it here. emp zero says duplicate class emp. Oh, I think we have a duplicate class emp, so I just wanted to remove that. Java training practical. Let's save it. So let's try to execute again. Compile again. I've made mistake here. I have to, because we have class emp, we have to do it with a class emp. Save it. Sorry for the mistake. Let's compile. We have saved the Java file as test.java. It's compiled successfully. Now let's try to execute. We have given the class name as emp. So how we have how to give the naming convention and all I have already covered in the lesson 1. I don't have to repeat this. So if your class is declared as emp, you have to execute as Java emp. Okay. So just cross check with your thinking of the answer. So earlier, now here we didn't initialize any values for these three instance variables. and because we have not initialized the value, that's why it is printing the default values. So the JVM is providing the default values for these uh, variables int eid, eid, ename, and salary. So we have int eid, the default value for int is 0. So the default value for the string is null, then default value for the float data type is 0.0. Okay, so that's why here it is giving the default values. So why we are now, so this is the problem. This is the problem. There is some issue with this code. So default values are not required. So it should not be printed. So in the project development or you have to give the valid or print the or output the valid data. So therefore, how to overcome this uh, default value initialized by the JVM is with the help of constructor. So let's use constructor to initialize the values. I mean, initialize the instance variables during the object creation. So at this point, we are using the constructor. So if you are not using, uh, actually the constructor is here, but we are using the default constructor. The default constructor will be here. Default constructor will be here. EMP with a empty with the empty implementation with a 0. So if you're not declaring at least one constructor, then compiler will be generating the default constructor at this point within the class. So this is how, as soon as the object is being created, so this default constructor will be called, then only then this display method will be called. Okay, so this is just default, so it's not required. It will be called automatically with at the backend. Okay, as soon as this object is created, then this void display method will be called and this default value will be printed. So these values are the instance variables. The instance variables is all over within the class. Okay, that's why we are printing the default values here. Now we have a problem here, that is we have printed the default values for these instance variables. Now let's try to overcome this problem. Now to overcome this problem, let's try to use one constructor, declare one constructor here. Let's say we have emp class name and the constructor name must be same. Let's try to initialize this value, initialize this instance variables. Let's say eid equal to, let's say 2833, and ename equal to, let's say slim, then salary is equal to, let's say 20,000.5. Yes, we have to give the f because default value for decimal point is double, so it is mandatory that we have, if you are declaring the data type as float, then it is mandatory that we have to use the constant f. Okay, now we have initialized, we have declared, this is the user defined constructor. Okay, this is not the default constructor because we don't have an empty implementation, we have a logics here. This is we have a few statements here. So for a default constructor, this should be the empty implementation and it should be zero argumented. This is zero argumented, but we have the logics here. So this is the user defined constructor with zero argument. Okay, you have to understand every bit of this zero argument, so because we don't have a constructor here. I mean, we don't have a parameter here. That's why it's a zero argumented constructor. So this part is the constructor, and what we have used this constructor is here purpose number 2 to initialize the instance variables during the object creation. So here exactly we are initializing the values to these instance variables. Okay, to initialize the instance variables during object creation. This during object creation is important because at the time of object creation, so as soon as this object is being created, this constructor part will be called, and as soon as this object is called, then those instance variables will be initialized during the time of object creation. So you have to understand, you have to remember this. So to initialize the instance variables during object creation, initialization of the instance variables take place during the object creation. Okay, so this is the purpose too. So let's try to save this. We have a emp, we have emp, just checking. Save this. After editing, we have to save and we have to compile it again. Test.java. Okay, compile successfully. Now let's try to execute this program. Java, we have class name emp. So here partially we have uh, solved the problem. So earlier when we are not using the constructor, the default value is being printed. Now here when we are using the constructor, we are given with the exact values, that is employee eid is equal to 833, then ename is equal to selling, then salary is equal to 20,000.5. Okay, now let's try to now let's say for here for this example we are using only one object. Now let's say we have two objects, that is two employees. Let's try to create another object, emp_t2. emp_t2 is equal to new emp. So this is the second object and we are trying to call this object. We are trying to call this method, I mean method, not object. T, let's just keep it as E, not T, so it's giving a valid meaning. Let's say this employee 1 and employee 2. Okay, let's say employee 2 dot TISP. Here we are not here T, it will give error. Let's see E1. So employee 1, display employee 1 details, it means display employee 1 details, then display employee 2 details. So let's try to execute this program. Let's try to save it. We have to save it after editing. Now let's try to compile this. Let's do clear. This is the command to compile the Java program. Compile successfully. Now let's try to execute. We have class name as emp. Now here details of the employee, two employees has been output printed here. This is the details for the first employee and this is for the second employee. But we have seen here that there is some problem with this output because we have two employees, the separate two employees. So for a different employee the details should be different, but here what we have seen is that for the two employees the details, the EID, the name and the salary is same. So therefore, to overcome this problem, we have to use the parameterized constructor. Okay, so here we have used the zero argumented constructor. So when we are using only one employee, it's giving the right output. But whereas when we are creating multiple objects, when we are creating uh, two employees, then it is printing the same value. So therefore, in order to overcome in order to overcome that problem, we have to use a parameterized constructor. Okay, parameterized constructor. I just wanted to edit this code here. Let's say, let's just remove this. This is giving problem. This is a user-defined constructor. This is a user-defined constructor. Let's solve this problem printing of the same details for the two employees. So we want to solve it with the help of using the parameterized constructor. Okay, now let's say we have a constructor emp, class name and the constructor name must be same. It is mandatory. It's a rule for the constructor in Java. So let's say we have a parameter three. Let's provide these three parameters, the instance variables: int eid, then string e name, then float e salary. Okay, this is a user defined constructor with three argumented constructor. So this is the constructor. So we have three parameters here. So int eid, string ename, float e salary. Okay, now this is a parameterized constructor with three argumented constructor. User defined. This is a user defined constructor with three argument. Okay, three parameters. Now these are the local variables. So in the variables concept, so the reason I am focusing on to understand those concept about variable and method and all, so is because in every Java projects you have to deal with these variables and all every concept for Java, like constructor, instance block, static block. When you are learning every bit of this Java concepts, you have to know the variables concept. So here we have three variables: EID, ename, and eSalary. And we have a data type, this is int, string, and float. Now, when you are declaring a variable or a parameter inside the constructor or method, now these variables are the local variables. Okay, always remember this. These are the local variables, and these variables eid, then ename, and eSalary is accessible only within this constructor, only within this constructor. It is not accessible to other methods and inside the class. So it is local and it is accessible only within this constructor. Similar to that, if you are declaring some parameters in this display, this method, then those variables will be accessible only within this class. It will not accessible to this constructor or inside the class. So therefore, we are declaring three parameters here. So these parameters are local variables. Okay, and it will be accessible only within this uh, constructor. So therefore, here uh, here what we are trying to do is we are just trying to, before this I just wanted to do this here. Let's try to call this display method inside the main method, because execution of the program start from the main method by the JVM. Okay, now we have test. No, I'm just writing test. So we have emp class here. Let's say we have employee one is equal to new new emp. Now we are trying to here we are trying to call this constructor emp with three parameters. Now I have told you that at the time of constructor calling, this part is the constructor calling, and not this part is the constructor calling. And at the time of constructor calling, we have to pass the values to the constructor. So we have three parameters here in eid, ename, and esalary. So we have to pass values. Now we have employee id. Let's say 2845. Then we have ename. Let's say employee Trashi, and let's say uh, yes, a monthly salary of 20,000.5. 20,000.5 F, 20,000.5 F, and this is how we are passing the values to these parameters. We have three parameters here. We have three parameters. So we are passing values to those values to this constructor. Okay, this is how we are doing. How we are passing the values to the constructor. At the time of the object creation, this constructor will be executed. Okay, now let's say we have created one object e1. So let's try to call e1 this method with this object tisp. Now if we try to execute this program, so it will not give an error, but it will print the default values. Why? Because actually we are passing the values here, but we are passing the values to these local variables. And so at the time of object creation, those parameters will be initialized with the values, that is 2845 Tashi and 20,000.5 will be assigned to these variables. But this will be the scope of this is a local variable, and the scope will be only within this constructor, and it will not be accessible to this method. So in order to make these local variables scope global or to access within the class, we have to convert these local variables to the instance variables, because instance variable is accessible anywhere within the class. So how we can do this is with the help of we have to use conversion, that is with the help of this keyword. Okay, so how we are using is we just have to let's say this is the when we here conversion of local variables to instance variables. Okay, now how we are converting this local to the instance variable is with the help of using this keyword. So this keyword is very important in Java. Okay, so you have to know. So let's say this dot, we have eid is equal to eid. So this is how we are converting. Now this part is the uh, this part is the instance variable, and this is the local variable. So this is how we are converting this local to the instance. Similar to this, we have to do same. This dot e name is equal to e name, and salary, this dot e sal is equal to e. This is how we are converting. This is the right part. So this eid, ename, and esalary is representing the local variable, whereas this.eid, this.ename, and this.esalary is representing the instance variable. So this is how we are converting these local variables to the instance variable. Now after doing this, what will happen is, now as soon as the object is being created here and values being passed, these values will be assigned to these local variables, the eid, ename, and esalary. Then after that, then the conversion will be taking place, because we are creating the object here, and constructor will be executed during the object creation. You have to remember, during object creation, always remember, during object creation, this constructor part will be executed. During the object creation, this value, this constructor will be called, then it will be, the constructor part will be executed. It will, now what happen, the values which we have provided here will be assigned to this constructor eid, ename, and esalary. Then after that, the initialization or the conversion will be taking place. So these local variables will be assigned to these instance variables. Now let's check the output. Let's just save this. We have test file, test.java, compile successfully. Now let's try to compile, I mean execute. JVM is always responsible for execution of the program. Compiler is for compiling of your code, conversion of your .class Java into .class, whereas JVM main responsible is loading the .class file into the memory and calling the main method for the execution. Okay, now at this time JVM will be doing the tasks. Java, we have class emp, Java emp. Now here we can see the details is being printed. Now let's say this is for only one employee, one object. Now let's create another object. Let's say we have second employee, that is e2. e2 is equal to new emp. Now we are using the same constructor, this constructor. So for that we have three parameters here. We have to pass three values, 28, 23. Let's say this is the employee ID, and let's say his name is again. Now let's say he has a monthly salary of 45,000. 45,000. Actually, she don't get 45,000. It's just sample program. Let's say we have employee E2 EMP. His employer is 2833. Name is Ugen. Then he has a monthly salary of 45,000. Okay. Now this is the employee. Now similar to the execution of this will be also getting executed. So let's try to call this display method for this E2 employee 2. Now, to understand this program, you have to also know the earlier programs. So because in the earlier programs, there is a error like when we are not using the constructor, and the default value is being printed. But even when we are using constructor without a parameter, the purpose is being served for one employee. But when we create multiple objects, multiple employee objects, then the problem arises in printing of the same details for the different employees. So therefore, so by using this parameterized constructor, so those problems have to be solved. Okay, now this is how we are doing. So we are creating second employee object. So since we are using this constructor, we have three parameters. We are passing the three values similar to that of a method. So if you understand method, you will understand this easily. So let's try to, now this part will be always remember that executed during the object creation. So similar to this will be also executed during the Now you have to remember is this part is executed, the constructor part. This is the constructor, and this part is executed during the object creation. During the object creation is important. Okay. So now let's try to execute this. We have done. I will talk on the flow of execution after this output. Let's try to save this. After editing, we always have to save the program. Let's compile. This is how we compile the program. Now it's compiled successful without any error. Now let's try to execute. JVM is responsible for this, responsible for execution. JVK Java. We have a class EMP. Okay, not test because we have already declared the class as test, but we have saved the file as test.java. So if you have declared the class as different name, different file name, then you have to give the class name at the time of execution. So we have emp class. Here we have emp class. Okay, here this is the emp. So that's why I'm using emp at the time of execution. So Java emp. Now see here, for different employees, we have two employees. For different employees, different detail is being printed. So this is how we are using the constructor in the projects. Okay, the actual purpose of the constructor that we have gone through two purpose of the constructor. One is writing the logics. Constructors can be also used to write the logics of your application, but writing logics inside the class is rarely used. It is used around 25%, as per I know from the internet and all. And the mostly this constructor is used in the initialization of the instance variables during the object creation. So 75% uh, of the programmers use these constructors in the for the initialization of the instance variables during the object creation. Okay. Now let's try to create another object. Let's say we have emp e3. We have to, let's say we have Sonam, and you have a salary of 50,000.4F. Let's try to call display this method for this emp3 e3 dot. Let's try to execute. Sorry. Compile successfully. Now here, so finally we have solved all the problems. So the first problem was default values being printed. The second problem was for different employees, same details is being printed. But now, after using the parameterized constructor for initialization, we have solved all these problems. Here we have employee E1 with the details. Then we have employee T2 with the different details from the E1. Then we have employee E3 with the details different from other two employees. So that's the actual purpose, the real purpose of the constructors in Java. Now, I hope you have understood where actually is this constructor part is executing, when this constructor part execution happens and all. Now, for you, just for a recap, I just wanted to show the flow execution of this. As soon as the JVM calls the main method, this object creation will be taking place here. This is object creation, the first statement. This object creation will be taking place now. As soon as this object creation is at the time of object creation, this is a constructor part. Now this constructor will be called. So now the program, this will look for a constructor in this class now. So here we have a constructor. As soon as the object is being created, then it will look for this constructor. Then this constructor part will be executed. The values will be assigned to these parameters here. We have three parameters. These values will be being assigned to these parameters. Then conversion will be taking place here inside the constructor. Then only after complete creating this object, then only so this e1.display will be called, and this eid ename esalary will be printed. This is printing the valid values because we have converted these local variables to the instance variables here. We are converted to this instance variable because of that. So this instance variables scope is anywhere. It can be accessed anywhere within the class. So that's why we are able to print the valid details. So this is how it is happening. Same for this employee E2 and E3. So I hope you have understood with this. So just one information here. Now I have used this here, right? So now this we have to use this only if you are declaring same variable names here. So we have same variable names for local and the instance. This is the instance variable eid, ename, and esalary, and this is the local variable. Now we have to do the conversion if you are giving the same name for this local variable and the instance variable. Now if you are using different name, like let's say you're using uh, uh, employee id as let's say let's say empid, then let's give the string name is emp name, then let's say salary float salary as emp salary. Now if you are declaring different name, then for this you don't have to use this. For the conversion you can just remove this and you can just use empid, then just say just remove this and just use emp name, just use this, remove this and just say emp salary. This will work perfectly. Okay, now let's try to execute this. Now let's try to save this and let's try to execute. Okay, we have class name test, we have file name test.java. It's giving error because we have changed the name here, so it should be emp id, emp name, emp salary. Okay, save it. So the you have to also read those error message. Let's try to compile this program. Compile successfully without any error. Now let's try to execute Java. We have plus emp. So that's all with this purpose of the constructor. Okay, now this is very important and you have to know the concept of this, how and where it is executing and all. Now I just wanted to give you one information one last information regarding this constructor. So after that, I'm going to look at one concept, that is constructor calling. Before that, let's just remove this. So I hope you have understood this. The purpose of the constructor. The first purpose is mainly for writing the logics of the application. So if you require if in the project, if you require a requirement you want to execute or execute some business logic at the time of object creation, you have to use the constructor. Okay. Now, writing of the logics within the constructor, it is rarely used. Mostly this constructor is mainly used in the initialization of the instance variables during the object creation. So during the object creation is important. Okay. Now that's all with the purpose of the constructor, and I just wanted to give you one information regarding this. One last information. We have let's say we have class emp, and let's say we have let's just declare one method void m1, always m1. This is just a simple example. Okay, let's try to print something here. So stm system dot out dot println. Let's say, sorry, this is the method one. Okay, now let's try to say we have one constructor here. Not test, we have to give emp. Always remember, class name and constructor name must be same. Must be same. So we have declared one method. Now we have declared one constructor here. Okay, now let's say we have one constructor, that is we have one parameterized constructor int a, and we are trying to print something here. So stm system dot println. Okay, constructor execute constructor execution one constructor. This is one argumented constructor. Okay, now we have declared one method here, then we have declared one constructor with one parameter int a. Now let's try to call this method m1. First we have to create object. Okay, notice we have to use emp. Always declare what we have declared the class here. Let's say e is equal to um, new emp, and we are trying to call e dot m1. So we are trying to call this m1 with this constructor, and in let's say this is employee one. Let's create another employee object. Let's say we have emp e2. Now e2 new emp. Let's say we have e2 dot m1. Now this is calling the default constructor. Okay, now here we are calling the one argumented constructor. So we have one parameter here, we have to pass the value. So let's say let's just wanted to pass the value as 10. So by now you have to know why we are passing value here and all, because we have one parameter here. So we have to pass exactly one value to this parameter, say at the time of object creation. So now just guess the output for this program. So what will be the output? So now you might be thinking that as soon as you create object here, e1 e dot, you might be thinking that as soon as you create this object, emp e1 is equal to new emp, at the time you might be thinking that this constructor will be calling a default constructor here within the class, and then e1 m1 method will be called, and this is m1, this is the m1 method will be printed. Again, this object 2 will be created. So this constructor, the user defined constructor, will be called, and then After that, it will be printing. This is the method 1. You might be thinking it this way, but it's wrong to think that way. So how I'm going to just execute this program. So this will give an error. It will give an error. So what is the error? So just read the error. Constructor EMP in class EMP. Constructor EMP in class EMP cannot be applied to given type E1 new. Required int found no argument. Reason actual and formal argument lists differ in length. So I hope you have understood this, understood the error message. What it is saying is that in a Java class, if you are not declaring at least one constructor, just remember that if you are not declaring any constructor, a single constructor within the class, then only at the time of compilation, the compiler is responsible for generating the default constructor. Here we are calling the default constructor. When we are creating the employee object at this point, you are calling the default constructor here. So here we don't have a default constructor. So what I'm trying to say you is that as soon as we are creating this object, a default this will look for a default constructor, but we have already one constructor here. So that's why it's giving an error. So that maybe the James Gosling has designed this in that way that if you are not declaring any constructor, at least one constructor in the class, then only compiler is responsible for generating the default constructor. Whereas if you are declaring at least one user-defined constructor, here we are declaring one user-defined constructor as emp int a. We are declaring the user-defined constructor here. So therefore, if you are declaring at least one constructor within the class, then compiler is not responsible, or it will not generate the default constructor. At this point, default constructor will be not generate because you have already created one user-defined constructor here. So if you are not declaring this constructor, then only this default constructor will be the default constructor will be generated by the compiler at the time of compilation. So but here for this we are creating the user defined constructor here. So that's why compiler will not generate the default constructor. That's why we can't use the default we can't use the zero up constructor here. I hope you have understood what I'm trying to say. So I'm just going to repeat this. So if you are not declaring at least one constructor in the class, then only compiler is responsible for generating the default constructor. But if you are declaring at least one constructor within the class, then JVM will not, compiler will not generate the default constructor. So you have to keep in mind this. You have to keep in mind. So this is important, this concept, because in the project level, you might be using the default constructor and you will be suffering when you are doing program or development of the application and all. Okay. Now that's all with the constructor part. That is purpose of the constructor, and this is just the concept I'm sharing you. Now let's move on with this. I have another. I have not prepared a slide for this. I just wanted to talk on this constructor calling. I've just here. I've not prepared a slide for this constructor calling. Constructor calling. Okay. Now for this constructor calling, I just wanted to discuss few cases. Now let's say case one. Let's say we have class days. Always class days. Then let's say we have class test, and then let's maybe it's better if we can just remove this, and if we can create one file. I am creating one Java file. Constructor calling. Let's discuss case one. So let's try to code it here. Let's declare one class. Let's say we have class test. You can also do this way. This is the way of creating array in Java. So let's declare one constructor here. Yes. So just here I'm just wanted to talk you on the constructor calling. Similar to that of method calling, we have also constructor calling in Java. Okay. These are just concepts that you have to know. Let's try to print something here. This is the logic of the application will be present here. Let's say this is the zero argumented constructor. Okay, now let's declare another constructor here. Yes, so constructor name and the class name must be same. This is the rule, and return type is not allowed. We are not declaring any return type here in front of this constructor. So this is the rule that you have to remember. Return types not allowed in constructor. Let's say we have one constructor here with one parameter. Let's see int a. Let's try to print something inside this constructor with the parameter 1. Let's say this is the one argumented constructor, and let's try to declare another constructor. Let's just try to copy paste it here. Let's say we have this is the two parameterized constructor, and this is the two argumented constructor. Okay. Now let's try to call these constructors. How we are calling constructor is that at the time of object creation, for the execution of the constructor, you have to create the object. So I've already highlighted on this, right? So let's say we have tst. Let's create one object. T1 is equal to yes. So for this we are execute for this constructor, for this object we are calling this zero argumented constructor. We have no argument here. Now let's create another object. Let's say test t2 is equal to new test. Now for this object we are calling this constructor with one parameter, so we have to pass value because we have one parameter here. Let's pass 10. Now let's create an object t3 now. Now for this object we are trying to call this constructor with two parameters. Let's say we just pass 10 and 20. Okay, now this is the case one. So we are trying to call those constructors. We have three constructors here. We have zero argument constructor, one argument constructor, and two argumented constructor. And here we are trying to create object and trying to call these constructors. So let's try to execute this in Java. This is how we compile the code, Java code. Yeah, compiled successfully. Now let's try to execute. JVM is responsible for this. We have class, I think we have class this. Yeah. we have class test. So here you are able to print those, print the 0 argument, 1 argument and constructor. At the time of object creation, this will be executed. During object creation is always during object creation is important to understand this constructor. So constructor execution is always taking place during the object creation. So here we are trying to create the object. So this is how we are creating object. This is one way using the new keyword. There are other ways also, but this is the one way of creating the object. Now, if you break down this, it has a different meaning, but as a whole, this is what we are doing is the object creation in Java. Okay. Now, this part is the constructor, and this constructor will be executed during object creation. It means it's calling this constructor in that it is executing and printing. So this is how we are writing the logics inside the constructor. Anything can be your business logic can be you can write the business logics here similar to that of the method. Okay. Now this is the case one. Entered into the real meaning of entering into the constructor. Control C, and let's try to paste it here. This is the case one. Okay. Now let's discuss the case two. The constructor calling. So let's just try to edit this code to case two. Case two. Let's just remove this. Let's just try to edit this for this case two. So here what we are trying to do is we are trying to create one object here. Okay. Now what we are doing is let's try to go into the real meaning, that is the topic, that is constructor calling. Constructor calling, how actually we are calling the constructor. So in Java we are calling the constructor using the this keyword. Okay. Now let's try to call this. We are creating only one object here. So when we are creating this object, this constructor will be executing. Okay. Now at the time of executing this constructor, let's call this constructor with one parameter. So how we are doing is we have to do like this. So we have to use this keyword to call the constructor. This is how we are calling the constructor. So we are calling this constructor, and here we have one parameter. So at the time of calling, we have to pass the value similar to what we are doing in the method. We are calling this. Now let's try to execute this. Compile successfully. We have a class test. Yeah, class test. Now this is how we are calling the constructor. So look at here. This is a simple program. So as soon as this object is being created, the zero argument constructor will be called. Then this statement will be executed. What this statement does is it is calling the constructor. So using this, then using close and open and close bracket. This is how we are calling the constructor in Java. So we are calling the constructor, this constructor, into the zero argumented constructor. Now similar to this, let's try to call this constructor in one parameterized constructor. Let's say we have we use this keyword to call the constructor, right? This dot, I mean not this dot, this dot. We have two parameters. We are trying to call this third constructor. the two argumented constructor. We have two parameters here, so we have to pass two parameters. Let's say pass 10 and 20. Okay, now let's try to check the output. Dot Java. Compile successfully. So here we are able to call all the three constructors. So this is the concept. This is the uh, uh, concept of constructor calling. So this is how we are case 3. Now let's move on with case 3. So this is how we are calling the constructor. Now let's see some errors and some rules that in declaring the constructor. So this is how we are calling the constructor in Java. So just use this keyword. Okay. So this is the case 2, right? Yeah. Case 2. Now let's move on with case 3. Now case 3 is, let's see, let's just try to remove this, just edit this code. Let's try to call the constructor. Let's try to call two constructors here. Let's say this. We're trying to call the constructor, the two argumented constructor into the zero argument constructor. Let's say we are passing 10 and 20. So as soon as this object is being created, constructor part will be executed, right? During object creation is important because constructor is always executed during the object creation. Now, as soon as this object is being created, this constructor, zero argumented constructor will be called. Then you might be, and what you might be thinking right now is that when you are doing this way, as soon as the object is being created here, then so this constructor will be executed. Then this statement, this dot 10, so it will call this constructor and it will print first, it will print the one argumented constructor. You might be thinking the output will be similar to this, one arg, this. So this will be printing print this one argument. As soon as this is statement is executed, this one arg constructor will be print. Then after that, this statement will be executed, called, and you might be thinking to arg.cons will be printed, and then after that only zero argument, zero arg might be. So you might be thinking, so this will be the output. So let's check it. What's the output? So if you're calling constructor this way, then it will give an error. The compiler will be given error. Okay, let's just try to save this. After editing, always save. Remember to save the code. Let's try to execute. Test.java. Okay. So I've told you now. So this code will give an error. The reason is that for the constructor calling, only the reason is here the error message. Let's first read the error message. Call to this must be the first statement in constructor. So let's just try to copy this. So this is the error message. What does it means is that call to this must be the first statement in constructor. Now what is trying to say is that when you are calling the constructor in Java, so this should be the first statement. This here it is the first statement. It is giving error because of this. We are trying to call the two parameterized constructor inside this, and this is not the first statement. We have already used this inside this zero argument constructor. That's why it is giving an error. So that the point here is one constructor. Now the point you have to remember is that one constructor is able to call only single constructor. So you have to remember that one constructor is able to call only one single constructor. It should not. It should be this way. So one constructor is able to call only one of the constructor. It should not call two or more. It should call only one. This is the rule. Okay. So that's why it is giving an error. But whereas for method, one method is able to call multiple methods. So but for constructor, one constructor is able to call only one constructor, one other constructor. So this is the case 3. This dot, not the dot, chain in 20. So this will give an error. Okay. So we should not call two constructors inside and constructor. Only one constructor. A single constructor is able to call only one constructor at a time. Okay. Now that's all with the constructor calling. I hope you have understood this constructor calling. We have discussed 3 cases here. Just we are trying to call the constructor, and the second case we have just tried to we have just checked calling some of the constructor here. We have used this keyword for calling the constructor, and we have just highlighted some errors if we are using if you're not using this keyword, if you're not calling the constructor as the first statement, okay, in Java. Now formats of object creation. So we have done with the constructor. That's all with the constructor. I think if you understand all the uh, things what I have delivered right now, I think that's enough for this. And so what you have to know is that you just have to know what is constructor, what are the types of constructor, the rules and rules to declare a constructor. These rules is very important, because if you're not following the rules, then it will give an error. Because even if in the real world also, if you're not following the rules, there is some problem. So that's why in Java also you have to follow some rules. For this constructor we have 3 rules, so you have to follow these rules, because class name, constructor name must be same. Okay. This is the first rule, and we have other 2 rules in the constructor. So I have already highlighted these rules, and we have also discussed on the purpose of the constructor. Now the main important thing is you have to understand is the purpose of the constructor. The purpose of the constructor, number one, is the constructors are similar to that of it is special method. It is used to write the logics of the application, business logic of the business application. Okay, business logics. It is used to write business logics, and the second one is most prominent one. Most programmers use is the second one, that is initialization of the instance variables during the object creation. You have to remember this during object creation is important. Initialization of the instance variables during the object creation. So these are the 2 purpose of the instance, I mean constructors. Okay. Now, lastly, I just wanted to discuss on the formats of the object creation. So, for the constructor, you have to know the object creation formats of the object creation. Mm, Now, let's discuss the formats of the object creation. I'm just coming to an end. Just it will take few minutes. Formats of the object creation. Now there is two formats when you are creating the object. The number one is named object, name object approach. So how we have created the object in earlier lessons is that we have just, if you have let's say we have class test and you have just create an object as test t is equal to new test t. So you have already learned what is the meaning of each part in this object creation. Okay, so this way, if you are creating object this way, then this is the named object approach. Creating the object with a name, we are giving the name here, so we are creating the object with a name t, object name is t. Now the second approach is, let's say we have, the second approach is nameless object approach. Nameless object approach is just ignoring this part, just you can create object with new test. So that's the two formats of object creation in Java with the new keyword. So let me just show one example regarding this. Maybe just let me, just wanted to remove this, just edit this to save the time. Now let's say we have three constructors here, the zero argument constructor, one argumented constructor, and two argumented constructor. Okay, now let's try to create object and try to execute these constructors. So let's try to create object first with a named object. Named object APP is, yes, name object approach. Now how we are using name approach is just test let's guess test t1 is equal to new test. So by doing this, we are calling the zero argumented constructor. Now let's create another named object. Test t2 new. Let's say we are calling this one parameter as constructor. Let's say we have 10, we are passing the value 10. We have another test t3 is equal to new test. We are trying to call this two parameterized constructor. Let's say we have 10 and 20. Okay, so this is the named approach. Now let's try to save it and let's try to execute this. It's executed, compile successful. I mean compilation, not execute. Sorry. Java test. So this is the execution. Now it is being printed. Zero constructor, one constructor. Now let me use nameless approach. This is the nameless object approach. Now how we are using nameless is just new test. So by doing this, we are not using name and we are calling this zero argument constructor. Now just say we are new test, just pass one argument, one value, I mean, and we'll call this one parameter constructor. We have another constructor new test, the two argumented constructor. Let's pass 10 and 20. Now let's try to save it. Always remember to save. CL is clear. Let's try to compile. Now it's compiled successfully. Now let's try to execute. So this is how we are using the named approach and nameless approach object creation in Java. So I hope you have understood these approaches, and also the constructor. What is constructor? Now I think that's all with today's lesson, O4. Before winding up, let me just try to summarize what we have learned in the lesson O4. Now, in the lesson O4, we have looked into constructors. So, what are constructors? So, constructors are nothing but it's a special method which is executed during the object creation. So during object creation is very important concept you have to uh, when you are dealing with this constructor. Okay, the constructor is a special method which can accept parameters which can accept parameters, and it is executed during object creation. Now, what are the types of constructor? Now, the types of constructor, we have the default constructor. First is a default constructor, which is generated by the compiler, and we have user defined constructor. Then we have also look at the rules. We have also uh, seen the rules in declaring the constructor, right? Now we have three rules when declaring the constructor. Now that the rule number one is constructor name and class name must be same. This is a very important rule that you have to remember while you are dealing with the constructor. Constructor name and class name must be same. Then constructor is able to take parameter. Constructor can accept parameters similar to that of the method. Then unlike a method, return types are not allowed in Java. I mean, construct return types are not allowed for constructor. In method, return types are allowed. So return type in method is mandatory, whereas for constructor, you're not allowed to declare any return type. So this is the three rules that you have to keep in mind when dealing with the constructor. Now, the last thing is that the purpose. So if there is no purpose, then there is no way that you have to study the purpose, study the concept of the constructor. So there is the purpose for using every bit of the Java, okay, every bit of Java concept like variables, method. So there will be a purpose. So the main purpose of the constructor is for number one is for writing the logics of the application similar to that of method. The constructors are also used to write the logics of the application, but most of the developers don't use to write the logics for this constructor. The most prominent one is the second purpose, that is they use it for initialization of the instance variable during the object creation. So how it is initialized and all I have shown you in the example. I hope you have understood it. Okay. So I think that's all with the summarization, and I think this is the end of the lesson 04.